This event will feature a panel discussion on the role of sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure for advancing gender equality and climate action. The event is co-hosted by UNOPS, the People's Republic of Bangladesh, and the Republic of Ghana. And I am pleased to be welcoming our panelists today. So today I welcome Mrs. Greta Fahemo, the UN Undersecretary General and UNOPS Executive Director. I welcome the Honorable Minister, Mr. Tazul Islam, Ministry of Local Government, Rural Development and Cooperatives from the Government of the People's Republic of Bangladesh. His Excellency, Mr. Harold Adlai Ageman, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of Ghana to the United Nations. Mr. Greg Monroe, the Director of Cities Alliance, a global partnership fighting urban poverty and supporting cities to deliver sustainable development. And last but not least, Mrs. Yolande Wright, the Global Director of Child Poverty, Climate and Urban at Save the Children International, a leading humanitarian aid organization for children. As we all know, climate change is accelerating. According to the latest report published in March of this year by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, around 40% of the world's population is deemed highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. This is a worrying statistic for all of us. What's even more worrying is that women and girls bear the brunt of this. Women and girls are the most affected by the climate emergency. Globally, 80% of people displaced due to climate change are women. Despite this reality, women continue to play a crucial role in climate change adaptation and mitigation. Tackling the effects of climate change and building the resilience of communities requires robust investments in sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure, with a strong emphasis on gender equality and women's empowerment. However, women and girls face social, economic, and political barriers that limit their access to infrastructure services, their access to resources, as well as their access to decision-making processes. This lack of access reduces their capacity to cope with climate change impacts. Rethinking how infrastructure is planned, designed, and managed with gender equality and women's empowerment in mind offer a unique opportunity for countries to think differently. Today's discussion will focus on the ways in which sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure has the potential to reduce the vulnerabilities that women, girls, and other disadvantaged groups face in the context of climate change. With the help of our esteemed panelists, we hope today to enhance our audience understanding of how to effectively plan and design gender-inclusive infrastructure for climate action and mitigation. Our discussion will be a time to share good practices and project examples that can be replicated for impact, and to build a collaborative environment for promoting the gender-inclusive and climate-resilient infrastructure of the future. We all know that infrastructure lasts for a long time, so we need to get it right. We also hope that today's discussion will illuminate the critical need to address the gender gap in infrastructure-related data, to better inform our infrastructure policy and our design choices. So without further ado, I would like now to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, President of the United Nations General Assembly, who was not able to be with us today, but he wished to deliver a video address.
Excellencies, colleagues, friends, women and girls continue to face several socio-political barriers that hinder their access to services and resources and their participation in decision-making processes. This puts them at a disadvantage on many fronts, including in terms of their capacity to cope with the consequences of climate change. I congratulate UNOPS, Bangladesh, and Ghana for convening this discussion and for helping to raise awareness on the relationship between gender and sustainable infrastructure. This discussion allows for an exchange of best practices and concrete examples and underscores how sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure can reduce the vulnerabilities faced by women and girls confronting climate change. Excellencies, I hope that today's discussion will also feed into the high-level meeting on the implementation of the new urban agenda, which I will convene on the 28th of April. This high-level meeting will emphasize the necessity of climate-resilient cities and infrastructure and provide us a critical opportunity to elevate the new urban agenda as a roadmap for accelerating sustainable development, climate action, and social resilience. As mentioned in the 6th IPCC report, sustainable urbanization is necessary to keep the 1.5 degrees target alive. In view of this, I've established an advisory committee on sustainable urbanization, bringing together member states and key stakeholders to generate momentum and to make this a priority issue on the global agenda while emphasizing its gender dimension. A key message we must press is that the UN must partner with and help mobilize sustainable and gender-sensitive urbanization professionals from across the world, including architects, surveyors, and urban planners. And just as important is the need to ensure that women architects, surveyors, and urban planners are afforded their respective seats at the table, whether implementing urban strategies that mitigate the threats of gender-based violence or establishing gender-positive spaces, such as lactation rooms for new mothers, as I'm doing here at the United Nations. We need the voices, ideas, concepts, and skills of women professionals. Their inputs are critical not only to more climate-resilient infrastructure, but also to urban planning and infrastructure that is gender-sensitive and responsive. Friends, as we recover better from the pandemic and strive to build climate-resilient communities and infrastructure, we must empower all people, but particularly women and girls who are on the front lines of combating the climate crisis. Only by recognizing and empowering them as powerful agents of change can we plan and build truly sustainable communities. I thank you.
We thank His Excellency for these remarks. And we're very happy to learn of the establishment of an advisory committee on sustainable urbanization to prioritize the issue of gender-inclusive infrastructure on the global agenda. I could not agree more that women need a seat at the table. We need to hear women and girls' voices when it comes to infrastructure and urban planning. This is how we fully address the needs of these women and girls and how we ensure that infrastructure can serve them equally. This is all more important when we know that infrastructure is critical to daily life, and even more so when communities are confronted with the devastating consequences of the climate crisis. I would like now to turn to our panel to start our discussion. The first question that comes to mind is really about gender mainstreaming in the planning, delivery, and management of infrastructure. How do we ensure that infrastructure is designed and built to maximize opportunities for women and girls while mitigating the constant threat of climate change? Greta, how can we maintain gender in infrastructure? What is UNOPS's experience in building infrastructure designed for women and girls while mitigating the risks of climate change?
So thank you so much, Emily. And first of all, I want to welcome my fellow panelists, as well as reminding ourselves about this important event, as it also falls into, again, this Commission on the Status of Women. In a way, the question posed in 2022 says it all. why didn't we already from the start ensure that in our urban planning or any planning is actually equally balanced on the needs of women and men? That we actually now need to ensure that we know what it is to gender mainstream our design, planning, and implementation and management of infrastructure to secure equal opportunities for women while we also fight climate change. At UNOPS, we know that this cannot be done by accident. We need a plan. So we have actually, based on the report that really showed how important it is to gender mainstream infrastructure planning, delivery, and management, also developed a strategy that allow us in practical terms to plan for how to ensure that this also meets the needs of women and girls. And also have done a step-by-step guide into how this actually works through the project cycle. And there is an example that I would like to mention. It is an infrastructure project, the American Center for Oriental Research, ACOR, in the Middle East region. First, we assessed gender needs, including the gender analysis report as a deliverable for the donor. We also engaged focus groups for discussion, and they actually also identified what was 25 concrete recommendations that went back into the rehabilitation design that we were tasked to do. So I think combination of ensuring that there is solid planning, there is a structured approach, ensuring that it meets the needs of all is what we at UNOPS strive for to do. And that has been mainstreamed as a core pledge in our strategic plan 2022 to 25. So I think I'll start with that, Emily, because it's really important for us to be practical in our approach to what gender mainstreaming actually means.
Thank you. Thank you for these insights, Greta. I now turn to you, Ambassador Agyeman. What has been Ghana's experience with gender mainstreaming in infrastructure planning, infrastructure delivery, and management? How is Ghana ensuring that infrastructure responds to the needs of women and girls, as well as to the needs of climate change?
Thank you very much, Greta. Let me begin, first of all, by commending you for the excellent moderation that you're doing for today's session, and also for the perspectives that you brought in your introductory remarks. I would also like to acknowledge my fellow panelists for today's session. I would begin by indicating that from our national perspective, we consider the mainstream of gender considerations in the planning, delivery, and management of infrastructure as critical to the entire process, mindful of the fact that there is a disproportionate impact of climate change on one gender, which needs to be recognized and addressed. I think that is a very important starting point that we all need to acknowledge. In Ghana, our process for infrastructure planning, delivery, and management is carried out essentially at the local government level, which is a primary unit of governance responsible for spatial as well as development planning. Despite central government's policy guidance and directions, however, we see some gaps in some local government districts in terms of the required level of compliance with gender mainstreaming. And nonetheless, when you look at the energy and water sectors, you can get some assurance that there's a general awareness, although when you look at the practices across the country, you see an uneven implementation of gender mainstreaming. If you take the case of the energy sector, for instance, and you take the situation of rural Ghana, you would see a significant reliance by rural communities on natural resources for wood fuel. And especially you see that in the northern parts of the country where the incidence is much more higher. And this is despite the government's effort to transition, to ensure that there's a transition to LPG, which is not all clean, but it's a transition fuel source. And the reason is that rural communities are more sensitive to price movements. And so despite the policy intentions, when there's market changes in prices, you find that they would feel that it's unaffordable. And so that is one area that we see still some gaps which need to be closed. In the water sector also, we see that the impact of climate change on the situation in the northern parts of the country, particularly in terms of drought and flooding, affects water sources. And as some of you may know, in rural communities, water is not piped into the homes. Water is drawn from direct sources. And so these are areas where we've had some useful impact in terms of trying to change government, trying to change the situation on the ground, but at the same time also witnessing that in some parts there are differences in the implementation of the policies. But essentially, we recognize that women and girls play a vital role as agents of change. And so the effort has been made to ensure that they are mainstreamed into all policies relating to infrastructure in a manner that would ensure that their resilience is enhanced as communities in rural Ghana. I think I'll put a stop to my remarks here, since the other panelists that need to make interventions on this matter also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your response, Ambassador, and for sharing these examples with us, because, you know, I think we all agree that there is sometimes a difference between the rural areas and what's being done in cities. And that actually brings me to our next panelist. I will now be turning to Mr. Monroe. And what I'd like to ask you is, you know, what has been the approach to gender mainstreaming in infrastructure at Cities Alliance? How has it helped mitigate the effects of climate change on women and girls?
Thanks, Emily. So for Cities Alliance, I'd like to raise 3 issues. The first is the central role of cities. Cities have a central role because both as a cause and as the solution for the climate crisis. They host 55% to 65% of the world's population, and this is growing rapidly. They contribute 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and 3/4 of them are already bearing the negative effects of climate change and related hazards. There's also a huge need for infrastructure in our rapidly growing cities. And it's been estimated that the urban infrastructure investment need is around $5 trillion annually. And rapid unplanned and informal urbanization is increasing as a trend, and especially in the global south, and increasingly Africa is overtaking Asia in this trend. The urban population is projected to double in the next 25 years. And with most of the growth occurring in informal settlements, urban poverty is increasing, and increasing rapidly. Our urban vulnerable populations, especially women and girls, are disproportionately affected by climate change due to the lack of access to infrastructure, such as clean water and sanitation. And for us, urban poverty, the face of all poverty, but for us, considering we work in cities, the face of urban poverty is undoubtedly women. So the central role of cities for infrastructure and for climate change and the vulnerability of women are core to our mandate. My second point is cities around the world are planned by men. And we see it in our everyday lives. So all you have to do, and we do it, is you speak to women residents of cities all over the world and what works and what does not work for them. And you'll see that most of this, all of this, is a consequence of the cities being designed by men. And we need to turn that on its head, because cities that work for women actually work for everyone. And you can't say that the other way around. That's the second most important aspect in terms of what influences our work. And the third, which my two previous panelists have already mentioned, is that climate change has gendered effects for multiple reasons. A lack of independent economic opportunities for women in informal settlements especially mean higher vulnerability to the effects of climate change. They control fewer economic resources, and women therefore have less capacity to cope in the event of disasters or climate-induced stresses, or to recover from those events or pandemics. And these events further disrupt livelihood sources, further affecting economic autonomy. And in many communities, the responsibility for the recovery falls on women. And for example, after flooding. So women end up in this increasing cycle of poverty and deprivation and the effects of climate change. So for us, we do a lot of work around planning, urban planning, getting inclusive urban planning, city development strategies, and planning for infrastructure as through a gender and climate lens in cities. And to include women, not in just asking them what needs to be done, involving them not only in the planning and design, but also the implementation, and also ensuring sustainability afterwards of that infrastructure. Thanks, Emily. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. I think you said something very important, right? That infrastructure that works for women works for everyone. And that's something that we all need to remember. I'll now turn it to Mrs. Wright. And what I'd like to know from you is, how is gender mainstreaming in infrastructure a key part of your work at Save the Children? What are your observations in terms of the benefits to reduce the burden of climate change on girls especially?
Thank you so much. And I'd also like to start by just saying thank you very much to all the other panelists and for inviting Save the Children along. The first thing to say is echoing, I think, some of the other panelists, that it's absolutely fundamental that gender equality is at the heart of everything we do. And I totally agree with what Greg said about infrastructure that works for women and girls, works for everybody. But also that we have been really blind to that in the history of infrastructure development. And if anyone who's read the book Invisible Women will be quite familiar with some of the ways, small and large, that we've designed our urban spaces, our infrastructure with a blindness to the needs of women and girls. So it's really important that we're discussing this. From Save the Children's perspective, I think we try to mainstream inclusion in all forms into everything that we do in our design of infrastructure. So of course we want to consider gender equality, but also all other forms of inclusion. So I do want to just mention also things like disability inclusion being really important. We want our infrastructure to work for everybody. We're committed to the rights of children, the rights of everybody, and therefore we need to be building that kind of inclusion lens in. The second thing I want to say is that we also have to mainstream the climate crisis and the differential impacts of the climate crisis on different types of infrastructure. So for us, those fundamental principles need to be in place. Then what we do is to mainstream it is do what Greta was talking about, putting in place very simple guidelines, very simple guidance for our staff, for the construction colleagues that are working on the ground, to make sure that we meaningfully do what we have in our principles, so that we engage with the communities, with the users of the infrastructure, whatever their gender, that we think about leadership teams and monitoring teams that represent the full community from the start to the completion of the project and the ongoing maintenance. And we need to make sure that all of the people involved in that process, from supply chain onwards, are understand how to embed those principles, how to have a gender equality lens in everything we do, and not just to think about women and girls as users, but also as leaders, as people who can actually be part of the decision-making processes going forwards, because I think that's really how to embed it into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for these insights, and thank you to all the panelists for your answers. I think what is very clear to us now is that infrastructure needs to work for everyone, otherwise it just doesn't work. What I've heard from your insights and your answers is that infrastructure, when it's not resilient, when it's not sustainable, and when it's not inclusive, it can, often become a central driver of social disadvantage for many, right? Infrastructure planning and design should really follow an inclusive approach in ensuring the participation of women and other vulnerable groups throughout the infrastructure life cycle, right? As you said, not only at the end, but really throughout the life cycle is very important. And so women and girls should be recognized as agents of change because they are leaders in their communities, and that needs to be taken into consideration. I also heard that it's important to mainstream gender and inclusion in infrastructure and climate change policies and legislation, right? It's really important that we do it at all levels. And so thank you for your insights. We'll now move to the second question. And my next question for the panel is, how can infrastructure be transformed in order to promote an accessible and functional environment for women's empowerment and participation? Again, Greta, I will start with you. And I will ask you, how is UNOPS transforming infrastructure to create a more accessible and functional environment for women and girls and other disadvantaged groups?
Thank you again. And I want to come back to what Yolanda pointed to, because gender blind infrastructure, what is it? And I think we've all experienced this from different perspectives. And I would like to share a very simple example from my period as minister in the Norwegian government. We had to go to the parliament quite often. And actually, it astonished me to see how women during the breaks had to queue up in front of the single toilet for women in the parliament. We talk 1990s. And men would do their things quickly, and they would have time for coffee. They would have time for a chat before the break was over. And you found this in concert halls. You found them, and we talk about Norway, 1990. And it's even done research. The most common current bathroom design actually means that women have to wait an average of 6 minutes to go, while men just wait 11 seconds. And why haven't this impacted architectural design, planning, decisions? Probably because all of those things are mainly managed by men. And I think this is also how we see it in UNOPS when we go about planning an infrastructure project. Maybe in remote, rural areas where there are violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, where there is lack of access to education. Why does this happen? Sometimes it's very simple things to provide sanitation facilities that are very important, we know, to women and girls' opportunities. They may actually fail education because these facilities don't work. And ill-lit roads, darkness, we know this is more challenging for women. We see it in unsafe public transport. What can we do to ensure there is safety? All these small things, hospitals built without reliable electricity, they become unsafe maternity wards. They have actually resulted in many preventable deaths. So this is why we have put gender at the center of infrastructure decision-making. Simply such as our gender mainstreaming actions work, as previously mentioned. And I also would like to pick up this fact about if we plan for women, we plan for the whole population. It has been done. In Vienna, it has actually been applied in different parts of the city for about 30 years. And what comes out of it is actually broader pavements, less hurdles, so it works for wheelchairs. Also parks planned So girls, don't stop going there because it's only about sports that boys do. But actually you have to understand what girls like to do and even plan for naming streets after women. I remember I pushed the mayor in a part of Copenhagen and said, why do you only have one statue named after a woman and 100 after men? First, I have to admit that he didn't like the question, but afterwards it actually caught fire and caused quite a discussion. The same happens in Barcelona. I could go on, but I think these examples we see from cities that have actually done their homework and how they went about it and learn is also something that we've taken to heart in UNOPS and try to fit it into our projects, as I said, through all phases, from concept, planning, design, implementation, management. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Heta, and thank you for sharing so many concrete examples, right? And these are legacy examples. And so it goes back to what we were saying earlier of, decisions we make today will have impacts on the future of women and girls. And so it's very important that we continue this conversation. I now see that the minister has joined us. And so welcome, Minister Tazul Islam. I will now hand it over to you. And what we would like to hear from you now is if you have comments and insights that you would like to share in which, in ways in which infrastructure can be transformed to ensure greater access and participation of women and girls in their environment.
Thank you very much. I am definitely audible to all the virtual forum, and I am extremely sorry that I joined very late because I was in traveling by air, and because of the mismatch of the actual traveling time, that I could join lately. Okay, anyway, so actually, if I like to say about the background of Bangladesh. Bangladesh have independent before 50 years under the leadership of our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And he was very optimistic about no one will be behind, that everybody, all the opportunity has to reach each and everybody. And his deliberation in many occasions, he was like to say that if one person, a single person will be homeless, so my politics is meaningless. And if anybody suffer by hunger, so the independent is not useful. So with this perception, actually gender equality and women empowerment, all these things he was giving the seriously emphasize to give the cross-sectional input. And since later, actually, just 1 decade more before, the continuously our father of the daughter of the father of the nation is in the power as a prime minister. So a lot of cross-sectional improvement in Bangladesh in terms of the per capita income and GDP. In all respect, it is we have achieved a good status. But actually, Bangladesh, about the climatic change and the challenges, whatever we are facing, actually, historically, Bangladesh is, according to the geological status, Bangladesh is the downstream of the Himalayan coast and in the bank of the Bay of Bengal. So in both sides, we have some opportunity, and both sides we have some of the challenges. So actually, climate changes is one of the cause the whole over the global community have reached to the conclusion that we have to face because of the carbon emission. So everything we are taking in cognizance. You see that tide, storm, cyclone, and erosion, and many causes. There is some sort of the climate refugees is creating, and the migration of the peoples from the rural area and the coastal area to the urban area. So all this we are taking in cognizance. So taking cognizance, cross-sectional input is giving, and we are actually for the coastal areas people, for the facing the challenges of the cyclone and many other climatic issues. So shelter are developing in such a way so that the women, child, and disabled people even could use that one. And so there is a challenges of the water, which is mostly women are using because the women are engaged themselves for cooking and men are in comparison to the men mostly. So the water scarcity could be rise. So with this perception, actually, rainwater harvesting system already been keeping there in the design and infrastructure. And after the cyclone or these kinds of a climatic, this kinds of disaster, so how could they can afford adopted with this kinds of a situation, and how could they can overcome the situation? So this is for that actually poverty reduction and income generation and the business involvement and even the women. Regarding the actually Bangladesh context, actually just 1.5 decade, Bangladesh has a tremendous changes for the women. And you see the Bangladesh, actually it was very, it is impossible to be appointed chief justice in the Supreme Court level. Now many numbers, secretary and the major general of the army and the superintendent of the police, and many district is outdoors job is very challenging, but women are now in the district commissioner. So that all this context and many women is coming up with the good numbers of enterprises. They are running big, they have created and they are running big numbers of a business house. So as because there is good numbers, so the woman is the idol and many where of the society. So rest of the women and the girls, they are following them, and the equality of the participation in education is very much actually obstacle free. So this is why, and our government is very much committed for 100% enrollment. So all this causes the women are getting chance. And beside that, you see the rural area, Bangladesh has a huge rural area. So the country is transforming to the urban area. Then in the rural area, the education as well as the communication system and healthcare and business enterprises and the market link, and where the women also they can engage themselves for cross-sectional issues, not only one issues. And the lower class women, same like the men, they could engage themselves for the cultivation, and some of the small enterprise they can develop. And as because Bangladesh everywhere electricity have been reached, though we are the country of the third world, but you see Bangladesh now that is everywhere there is electricity, and most of the houses is connected with the internet. So the many girls they are getting, some of them even middle class educated and lower class educated, they can also penetrate it in the internet, and through internet, and they are developing some sort of the e-commerce house, so that through that they can do. So it is a Bangladesh, I think, we our for national demand, and as well as a signatory of SDG. So we are very much optimistic about the women empowerment and women participation or anywhere else. And I think whatever the because the time constant, maybe I cannot say everything, but actually we are doing very seriously each and every one. Besides that, we have a safety net program, social safety net program, where from this social safety net program, the girls or the women, those who are behind, they could not engage themselves. That might be they have some source of the drawback. Maybe they do not have the literacy. Even after that, how could they can engage and how could they survive? How could they promote? Government is giving cross-sectional program for them. And of course, the development partners are engaging with us like World Bank, Asian Development, JICA, and many other files. And UN, actually UN Ops also working in globally. And I, from my personal part, I am appreciating the UN Ops to invite me to engage with this occasion and give the synopsis status of Bangladesh. So thank you very much. If any question, I can join with you again. Yeah, thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Minister. And I think you brought out a very important element, which is the one of leaving no one behind. That really needs to be at the core of what we do. And so picking up on that, Ambassador Aguiman, in your opinion, how can Ghana actually transform infrastructure to create an environment that promotes women's empowerment and participation?
Thank you very much for the question. And let me also welcome the Honorable Minister from Bangladesh and for his perspectives on the question that was posed to him. I also wanted to comment on the USG Greta's remark that planning for women, you plan for the whole of society. And it reminds me very much of a saying that one of our foremost educationists in the 1920s used to say, that if you educate a man, you educate an individual, but if you educate a woman, you educate the entire nation. And I think that that is reflective of the discussions that we are having here. I would also want to focus a bit more on the rural women in Ghana in this perspective also, because at least in the urban areas, there's some amount of efforts to ensure parity in terms of infrastructure responding to the needs of all, even though it might not be fully effective. And I would begin by saying that the need to ensure that infrastructure is accessible and functional and empower women's participation requires one, not to shift the activities of women towards a desired point, but rather to bring infrastructure to support where they are in a way that makes them fully functional in the things that they are already doing. And I would like to look at it from one of the dominant areas where women are very much engaged in, and that is in the food production and food distribution processes in Ghana. When one looks at this area or space, you can tell that there's a lot that can be done to ensure that the infrastructure that is put at the disposal of such communities would be able to ensure the full functionality of women and to empower them in terms of economic empowerment, in terms of ensuring their dominance in the sector. And some of the things that can be done is to ensure, for instance, that you have all-weather roads leading to farm gates. These are simple but important things that need to be done, because some of the farm areas are in very remote areas. The women go through a lot of challenges to be able to access the farms and to be able to bring the food products into the market. Another area is in the area of aggregation, processing and storage facilities for farm products, which will ensure that post-harvest losses are reduced, which will ensure that the shelf life of food products are kept much longer. Also, the development of soft infrastructure, for instance, ICT, and I heard ICT being mentioned by the minister from Bangladesh, but ICT in a way that enables women farmers or women farmers to know when to plant, because as climate change impacts, you need to be very careful about the timing of planting. You need to be mindful about the amount of water that is going to be available. Also pricing, and some of these things have been done in experimental basis in some places, which can be upskilled in terms of ensuring that the women are aware of the market prices and do not sell short by predatory buyers at the farm gates and other things like that. I would also want to talk about some other infrastructure that need to be, that are being done actually in terms of bringing healthcare to the doorsteps of rural women. In Ghana, we have this community-based health planning and services compounds. They call them CHIPS. And these are compounds that are multi-purpose in terms of serving primary healthcare needs, but also maternal healthcare needs. And so these are things that are being done to ensure that the vulnerabilities of rural women particularly are reduced, and they are then in a position to be able to undertake their economic activities in a way that does not detract them from seeking healthcare from remote locations, as would normally be the case. Of course, not all parts of the rural communities would have this, especially in some parts of the country where the populations are smaller and dispersed. And so you have mobile community healthcare workers filling in for that. Also, an important thing that needs to be taken into account in this discussion is what government is trying to do with the free compulsory universal basic education, which is up to the secondary school level, to ensure that both boys and girls have equal education up to the secondary school level. Normally for rural families, if there's a choice that have to be made in terms of whether to educate a boy or whether to educate a girl, the likelihood, if government did not step in, would have been that the choice will be made in favor of the boy. And so this ensures that girls have access to education. And some of these educational institutions also, as USJ Greta indicated, attention is paid to the infrastructure. So when you are building the sanitary facilities, you ensure that there's adequate facilities for girls in terms of they being able to use the bathrooms in a manner that is supportive of their needs, rather than doing a one-size-fits-all model that does not work for girls. The important thing, though, is that there's a need to ensure that you have the disaggregated data to be able to understand where the needs are and to respond effectively through the policymaking process in a way that ensures that the peculiar needs of women and girls in particular, as it relates to the impact that they receive or that they feel from the climate vulnerabilities, are addressed in a manner that ensures that they have full inclusion in all aspects of social, political, and economic life. I think I'll end my remarks here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. And thank you again for providing those concrete examples from the rural areas. And now I go back to Mr. Monroe, because you look at it from the perspective of cities and people who live in cities. Would you have some insights to share with us on this topic?
Yes, thanks, Emily. I'll be quite brief, just in the interest of time. But, it's not a case of consulting 50 women in a community and then slapping in the infrastructure with some vague nod to what the women have said. It goes, and that's often what does happen.
Yeah.
Under the guise of we are doing woman-led infrastructure. Let's not pretend, because that actually does happen. So for us in the cities that we work in, it's a whole cycle. It's about the planning, the implementation, and the management of that infrastructure. And I would like to add the ownership, because in a sense, we need to talk about the community ownership of infrastructure, and that the infrastructure is used as a focal point for the development of that community. It's not slapping in some bricks and mortar. It's much, much more. And we need to think of infrastructure in that developmental context. So in the planning phase, it is important to have participatory assessments and to engage all stakeholders in order to understand if the needs of all beneficiaries are addressed. And at the same time, acknowledge that some communities living in an informal settlement and the government representatives around the same table may not agree, and the donor. And it's to find that common ground where it works for the people that the infrastructure is supposed to serve. In the implementation phase, it's essential to have a gender-sensitive design process, and we've learned that you're not going to get that unless you have women included in the design process. And to co-create and implement solutions directly with women, and to train women community members on how to build and maintain that infrastructure for long-term sustainability. So again, it's not putting in infrastructure and then getting outsiders to come in. It's actually training community work, women in the community to help with the maintenance of that infrastructure and the monitoring and using it for development. Now we can do that in all aspects of our infrastructure, and that includes energy, transport, ICT, solid waste management, water sanitation, as well as vertical infrastructure. But as His Excellency mentioned education, I want to mention water. And water scarcity and the lack of water and sanitation infrastructure directly affects women. And you want to go into informal settlements and look at the women living there and say, and start saying, where are their health services? Where's their sexual and reproductive health services? Where's the menstrual hygiene stuff? You can't even start talking about that when there's no water. So the climate crisis has put somewhere close to 300 million people globally at extreme high water stress. And this number is going to double by the next 20 to 30 years. And access to water and sanitation infrastructure is one of the factors that most define the gender inequality gap, especially in the slum communities. And I was flabbergasted to find that 73% of the global population don't have access to adequate sanitation. And while we're on that, we talk about people having access to water. I'll say right now, if your water consumes more than 10% of your income, and you have to walk more than a kilometer to get that water, you do not have access to water. So you must be careful about this word we use as access in infrastructure. It's about meaningful access. If your job means that you are one meal away from starvation, you do not have meaningful employment. So I think we need to be really careful how we talk about access to infrastructure. And globally, 80% of households with water scarcity, it is a woman who's responsible for fetching water, to collecting water, to managing the water. And again, this is the more women are propelled into doing this and they have no real access to water, the less time they have available for education and economic opportunities. And we go right back to the beginning again about the cycle of deprivation for women. And I just want to also, I'm not going to go more than I'm just going to mention it because His Excellency said it about disaggregated data. We need to know what the baseline is, and we need to monitor our improvements and our investments. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Mr. Munro. A lot of very important points there in terms of the words that we use and in terms of how we refer to access to infrastructure. Mrs. Wright, I saw you nodding your head many, many times and listening to your other panel members. How about you at Save the Children? How do you look at this? And how do you look at this through the lens of children, but also girls, women in particular? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, and I must agree with a lot of the other panelists, and it's lovely to be joined by the Minister from Bangladesh. I worked in Bangladesh myself for 6 years, and a huge fondness for your wonderful country. I wanted to just say, again, I think I mentioned it already before, but for us fundamentally is the basic commitment to rights. And we've talked about many child rights across the panel, right? The right to education, the right to access to water, the right to food, the right to full and meaningful participation. And so I think if you start with that rights-based focus, it goes a long way to getting the transformation that we need to see. The second thing is to say that we do need to plan and budget for making the time to do things right. So if you're going to really address gender and power dynamics, you need to be able to think about that right the way through and have a bit of time. Same for climate. There's a huge amount of risk and understanding risk that needs to happen if you're going to design well for the climate crisis as well. So we need to sort of reckon that we can't just do business as usual. We need to plan and take some time to build those thoughts in. The second thing I want to mention is since we're trying to think of what could be really transformative, is to mention education again. And I know His Excellency from Ghana mentioned education. I do feel that one of the early formative experiences for a human being is their time in school. And if girls experience school in a discriminatory way, that's setting them up for the rest of their life. And there's a huge number of ways in which Save the Children in particular try to look at schools from a very holistic way, how to create a safe school environment for all pupils. And a lot of that requires us to think about all the pupils and all of their different and varied needs. And we talked about the need for access to water, the need to adequate sanitation facilities. And that doesn't necessarily mean the same toilet for the girls and the boys. And I have to emphasize this because I had a fantastic conversation with one of our female architects who works in Bangladesh about the different needs of girls and boys in their toilet facilities, right? The simplest things, like the girls need a hook, a simple metal hook, a nail to hang up their shalwar or their shawl while they use the toilet facilities. Obviously, girls have periods once a month. They need to be able to wash their reusable pads and put them somewhere. They may need a screened area to deal with those things rather than just in the toilet. And dealing with your periods takes a bit more time, so you may need more facilities. So just thinking things through properly so that even the most basic environment that girls and boys go to, the school, is a safe place and a place where they can equally participate. Because we really need to address things like the dropping out of girls from senior school if we are going to create the societies that we want in the world. And it's not just toilet facilities, we also need to think about safe access. Greta mentioned lighting. We need to think about things we discovered in one of our programs when we started to be thinking more about inclusivity, that girls had a real concern about going home at night from secondary schools. It's a long distance. We needed to build in accommodation for girls' safety to be able to stay at school and to complete their secondary education. So I just picked on education infrastructure for one, but I totally agree with what was said. We need to think about all of the ways in which we need to create equal access for girls and boys, information, digital connectivity, but I thought I'd just pick concretely on some of those school examples. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I think, we could spend the whole day talking about the importance of infrastructure education. And when I think of all of the elements that you've all raised when we were discussing this question, whether it's water, whether it's education, whether it's, looking at crops, it all goes down to data and making sure that we have the right data to write to make the right decisions. And so I think that's also a very important element of this discussion. And so we only have half an hour left. And so now I'd like to change gear a little bit. And I would really like us to dig a bit deeper into specific project examples and best practices, right? Because we've talked a lot about, in theory, what it should be. But now what I would like to hear you on is, what are the best practices of gender inclusive infrastructure? And to understand better from all of you the impact that this would have on addressing social inequalities and poverty while supporting low emissions and a resilient future, right? And so, Greta, I'll ask you first, if you have any best practices to share with the group in the area of gender inclusive infrastructure, and if you could elaborate a little bit on the benefits that these examples bring to addressing social inequality and a better quality of life for all.
Thank you. I would love to do that. And I thought I'd mention a very concrete example from Sierra Leone. We have been working with the British government as well as the national government in Sierra Leone on what is called the Rural Renewable Energy Program. And this project brings clean, renewable energy to rural communities in Sierra Leone. And I still remember my conversation with the president when he said there is access for 1% of the population in rural areas. This is really telling me that it's important. And it's the first time many of these communities have had reliable electricity, and bringing with it many new business opportunities and also economic benefits. We have been working with IOM to encourage women entrepreneurship. And we signed an MOU together regarding training, coaching, mentoring women and young entrepreneurs, and connect them to financing sources, starting with a matching grant and then extending to other funding sources. What we see now is 56% of the grant beneficiaries are women, and they are all promoting women entrepreneurship in one form or another. And we discovered that in most areas where this program is being implemented, most of the community business partners are also women, active in agriculture and local commerce. And beneficiaries have been involved in promoting sustainability initiatives and actively encouraging women and girls' participation in activities that led to effective climate action. And one of the grant recipients provides training to women business coaches and trainers who then deliver training to aspiring female entrepreneurs organized into what is called village savings and lending associations. The women are later, I think they can borrow actually the solar powered appliances and equipment to start their own businesses. So not buying, but borrowing. Another recipient promoted WASH via the drilling of boreholes and the purification and distribution of water to reduce the burden of collecting water and improve the quality of life for girls and women in the community. And the initiative committed to employing, and I think this is really crucial, 50% female agents to oversee tap management. It may sound simple, but having also that included in the program is key to ensure the access to water over time, because there is self-interest in making sure it works. I could go on, Emily, but these examples, they come from Pakistan, they come from Nepal. They are really important. I mean, in Nepal, we have included all female work sites when we have been working with the government and UNDP to successfully reconstruct 50,000 homes that were destroyed after the 2015 earthquake. And to our knowledge, this is the first in Nepal and a significant achievement to support gender equality in an industry, again, we know are mainly dominated by men. So thank you.
Thank you, Greta. Thank you for sharing these examples. I think it's so important for us to talk about, these issues in a concrete manner, because we are all looking for answers, right? We're all looking for solutions. And so, to look at examples of what has been done elsewhere is, in my opinion, very, very useful. And now I'll turn to you, Minister, because, in the spirit of looking at very concrete examples and best practices, could you share with us some of the best practices that you have put forward in Bangladesh, and how could we as a community benefit from some of the work that you have done in your country? Oh, you are on mute, Minister.
Yeah, right.
Yes, we hear you now. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, thank you. Yeah, as I mentioned, that actually Bangladesh, whole country have been electrified, and the internet connectivity already reached. So many women and the girls, they could engage themselves for the some sorts of the e-commerce business, and that they are selling and buying many things else within the country and within the abroad. So this could be one. And beside that, actually, from my perception, actually, I like to say that many rapidly these kinds of activities could grow up if we can make them training and learning the experiences. So I think it could be the one of the best practices. And regarding the ICT and sanitation on water, actually, we have a coverage of the full coverage of the water. So in this context, we are in a safer side. But of course, the quality one, the safe water is the challenge. And actually, every individual are connected with the water is not everywhere is available. But we are doing for that. And about the sanitation, also, we have a good numbers of the success, but actually we are continuously giving our effort about this one. And actually another fundamental cause is, from my personal perception, law and order and the security of the woman. Actually, the man can move anywhere else smartly, and for the girls, actually, state law and order is it has to be ensured. So this is why the harassment to the woman, a law have been adopted from the parliament, has been passed, and the capital punishment is ensuring those who are doing these kinds of any disgusting thing. So and actually beside that, as I express my thanks, I am feeling proud that somebody else have joined in this occasion. Actually, I cannot recall her name. She was in Bangladesh and she has a good numbers of experience. Through his this interaction, he have pointed out that, yeah, and nicely you have pointed out, actually I have taken the note, hook and nail, and to hang the clothes in the toilet. It is one of the fundamental requirement, and also hygiene. And beside that, actually I am thinking over some sort of the infrastructure has to be developed. The girls, women, those who wants to engage them physically in trade and commerce, and this can in the business center, some sort of the infrastructure facility will keep reserved a percentage for the women, so the women will be prioritized and they will get the opportunity. And regarding all the other issue, actually we are giving I think effort from our side for from the government side, and we are really committed to empower the women in our country. Our prime minister is a woman, and a lot of women is also opposition leader is a woman, and many political parties leader is a woman, and men, and good numbers of the well-educated women are every time are voicing about the woman. So I think this is one of the issue. Some orator have been mentioned that the voice of the woman is very important. So in Bangladesh, this kinds of facility is prevailing. From my perception, actually, if I say if anything new, we are from this occasion, we could you can identify and offer us. So definitely, if it is competent for Bangladesh, then definitely I will welcome it. And from my perception, I think at this moment we are doing all the available sources, knowledges to implement in Bangladesh for groom up the girls as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. And I'm glad that, the comment from Mrs. Wright is something that you will be taking forward. And, I hope when we visit Bangladesh soon, we'll be able to see this in all the toilets in education institutions. So I'm looking forward to that. Now I'll turn to you, Ambassador Aguieman, and I will ask you the same question. We would be very happy to hear what are some of the best practices that you have put forward in Ghana, and how can we learn from that?
Thank you very much. And I would want to take this question from the perspective of the normative framework that we have in terms of what we're doing normatively to address this challenge. And let me begin also by indicating that the government of Ghana is very much committed to the twin goals of reducing gender inequality, as well as implementing the carbon action to leave no one behind. We have mainstreamed the gender issues through the National Climate Change Policy. And that is what outlines a vision and objectives with respect to the effective adaptation, social development, and mitigation measures required to ensure that even as we increase infrastructure and community resilience and equitable social development, these are kept in focus in the way and manner in which government acts. Through this policy, which is also aligned to our national development framework, we have developed a fully gender integrated national adaptation plan in an effort to build nationwide resilience to climate change impacts. And in the policy, it describes the differences in the vulnerabilities between men and women. as well as provides a roadmap for the actions that are necessary to ensure that we are able to address them. We use future projections of climate impacts based on a timescale that goes up to the year 2080. And it is important to also mention that even though, and I think it was Greg who had mentioned it, that you don't just identify a few women and then say that you've come to a conclusion. And so it's important that women should form part of the full cycle of decision-making in the delivery, planning, and management, and in the planning, delivery, and management of these infrastructure to ensure that the climate resilience is achieved. I must say that in Ghana, when you take the two professional bodies that are responsible for spatial and fiscal development, essentially the Ghana Institution of Engineers, as well as the Ghana Institute of Architects, I think that awareness is beginning to deepen among the professionals. And I'm happy to recall that in 2017, we had the very first president of the Ghana Institution of Engineers, which has been an institution in existence for many years. Unfortunately, there's a man now currently heading it, but I don't think the commitment has gone any way down than it was. Recently also, under the leadership of the Ministry of Environment, Science and Technology and Innovation, in collaboration with the Global Center for Adaptation, the University of Oxford, the United Nations Office for Project Services, and the United Nations Environment Programme, Ghana has quantified for the first time its climate adaptation needs across the energy, water, and transport sectors with gender integration. And based on these needs, government stakeholders have identified a roadmap of investments and policies and accompanying financing options to meet adaptation needs. And so we are hopeful that these measures that have been put in place would lead us to the ultimate objectives that we seek to ensure that the gender dimension of the climate impact is mainstreamed in all the infrastructure projects that government is going to undertake in Ghana. I would end here at this stage.
Thank you, Ambassador. And now I will turn it over to Mr. Monroe, because again, the question is a simple one. What I would really like to hear from you are, some concrete examples. What are some of the things that work, and why should we pay attention to those and try to replicate that elsewhere?
Good. So just some examples. Tunisia. So we have a project called Femedina, and we've carried out 5 co-design sessions and with a few hundred women of the Medina of Tunis to develop more inclusive, accessible, and safe spaces. And this was one area where women were said, we do not feel safe. We don't feel like we belong here because it's not built for us. And 6 spaces have now been refurbished, led by women in the Medina in Tunis. And more cities will follow the same project approach in a second phase soon. So, and importantly, we now have a specific tool for policymakers to assess urban vulnerability to climate change through a gender lens and to assess level of gender mainstreaming of projects. And we're going to apply this soon in Morocco and in Jordan. So we want to roll this out. USG, Greta's already mentioned Nepal, but so we are working with the UNOPS country office in looking at earthquake resilient infrastructure, but done through a gender lens and a gender programming lens. And interestingly, is a number of donors are looking at this as in Nepal as a project, because as a new way of actually looking at some of this infrastructure work. So I'm hoping it will be replicated in many parts of the world. Liberia, we gathered women's ideas and needs through a very dedicated participatory process related to the formation of a city development strategy. And from this process, it emerged that one of the main issues, especially in the informal settlements, was a lack of water and sanitation facilities. And compounded was COVID. So while we were telling the world to wash their hands, in Painesville and Monrovia, the informal settlement don't even have water to wash their hands. So through the Community Upgrading Fund project, since 2019, we've constructed more than 100 water kiosks with the community for better sanitation. And because of the COVID crisis, we then worked with them in producing another 100 water points for that community and water kiosks. And women have been a key component of this initiative. And we've empowered young women to take on leading roles in water committees and to manage these water kiosks going into the future. What it has done is also relieved women of this burden of water collection and water gathering, the time that it took to do that. So it allows them more time for economic opportunities. One of our flagship projects in Uganda is the Kampala-Jinja Expressway, the No One Worse Off project. And again, after an assessment of water and sanitation conditions in the communities, we trained men and women, 50% men, 50% women, to construct biosewer toilets. And we are also carrying out the training of men and women from the community to manage water in that community, as well as the wetland restoration, because the expressway goes right next to a wetland. And we're using this as an opportunity to also improve the environmental conditions in the area, or facilitating communities' engagement with the improvement of environmental conditions in the area. Those are just 4 immediate examples of work that we are actually currently doing.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing those. Mrs. Wright, same question to you, right? What works and how can we make sure that we do it in more places?
Thank you so much. And I think I might be repeating myself a bit, but I'm going to focus on 3 things. The first thing is what works is fundamentally involving women and girls alongside men and boys in all aspects of decision making and design. And we also have some examples of women-only construction groups that we worked with. So for example, in the Rohingya camps that are hosted in Bangladesh, we worked with a women-only construction group led by or supported by one of our female architects. And it was incredible that even in 2021, setting up a women-only construction group was quite groundbreaking and tricky and required quite a lot of thinking. And initially, the only women who came forward were women from female-headed households. So there was obviously already a little bit of a barrier for women to come forward if they had a male household member. So, but women who are female-headed households, which you know often are living in more extreme poverty, they were keen and willing. We had to overcome a huge number of barriers for that women's group to kind of even find people who are willing to have the women's group construct their houses. So we had to kind of battle a lot of social norms and concerns about the quality of the women's work. And I think, but we can't stop those battles, and we have to actually kind of keep going with them, right? Because if we want equality, if we want women to be trained and to be able to be equal participants in the workforce, we can't just allow these kind of assumptions to continue and these prejudices to continue. And actually what's wonderful to hear is now that group has been much more normalized. And that is always also not just women working alone, but now we're seeing women and men working together on the construction projects, and that the women's quality of work is being well acknowledged as up to standard and beautiful and as the men's. So that was one thing, is kind of getting women and girls into those kind of non-traditional roles, girls into STEM subjects. We have to be looking at that throughout our education, higher education, apprenticeship and employment schemes. The second thing I want to give an example about is around climate resilience. And again, involving women in the decision making and in even as women architects has really helped us to build more climate resilient and appropriate infrastructure as well. So for example, we have early childhood centres where children and mothers can come and be exposed to sort of early childhood development. We've started to design them with those women more in mind, and also with climate shocks in mind. And we've done things like increasing passive ventilation, so creating smaller gaps that allow wind to pass through. It naturally cools down without even needing to have electricity and air conditioning. So naturally cooler buildings with more screens that provide more privacy. We started to build in green walls where we can allow for things like small vegetable plots, etc. It built into the design of the buildings. Longer roofs that allow for recognizing that we're going to get heavier and more extreme rainfall, and then collecting that water so that we can store water and use it for hand washing, sanitary, water and sanitation facilities. So all of those designs have started to come forward, partly through our more inclusive and participatory design processes and involving more women architects. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is alliances, and Greg might smile at this, because Save the Children works in a number of different alliances on disaster risk reduction, on cities for children, and actually to create the transformations we need to see, we do need to work with governments, with the private sector, and with civil society and community groups, because together we can really bring about these transformations. And I'll give one small example from during COVID. We were working through our Cities for Children Alliance to recognise the need to improve more sanitation facilities. All of these instructions, everyone was wash your hands for COVID, and people just didn't have enough facilities. And working with the private sector, we were able to roll out in places like Kenya rapidly better hand washing facilities that were more appropriately heighted as well, lower ones for younger children to be able to wash their hands. And through those kind of partnerships, I think we can really make the transformations we need to see. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. This is so encouraging to hear of all these examples of what happens. What happens when gender and inclusion are mainstreamed and they're supported by adequate financing and, technical capabilities, and, how do we make sure that it works? And to hear all of these concrete examples has been very inspiring, actually. And given that we only have 7 minutes left, it's good that we're ending our conversation on such positive examples. And before we end today's panel and the discussion, I would still like to ask each of you, and I want one word or one sentence, right? What do you think we should be doing to ensure that this gender mainstreaming is something that we do in infrastructure all the time, right? If you can pick one word, if you can leave our audience with something that they need to think of and remember when they think about infrastructure, what would it be? And I will go in the same order. I will start with you, Greta.
Thank you. I would say we need to message regarding what this is about. We have done research together with Oxford University, and when you see that poor infrastructure actually causes maybe close to 8% of all greenhouse gas emissions, we have to do something with it. And the same with the adaptation costs. I mean, 88% they found out are linked to adaptation costs. So message and sort of facilitate a change.
Thank you, Minister. Now to you, one word or one sentence. You're on mute.
Yeah, anyway, actually about the carbon emission, if I like to say about this is actually, if we was to address this, we almost all, I think 80% carbon emission is doing by the developed countries. And they have a good numbers of the coal-based power plant and oil-based. So this is the issue. Actually, not I will be wise to discuss in here. And about some other issue, actually, Rohingya issue have been raised here. Thank you very much for raising. You see, on humanitarian cause, our honorable Prime Minister agreed more than 1 million peoples to give the shelter, and which is caused the very devastating situation for the home that is host communities. And despite it, all these things we are doing, giving them full support, but I think it has to be compared with the global context, that how many refugees who are giving shelter. Now there is, if it is a good example, then whenever the refugee from the Syria and now very recently from the Ukraine, so global community is taking in concern. But actually, why will not they take it in very serious concern issue? That is because of the humanitarian cause we have sheltered them, but their own land is the Myanmar. Myanmar, it is a plenty of land. Bangladesh is a 5 times bigger country. So what the use of they are not repatriate them? If they can use, they can bring, they can convert them in the productivity, which could be they can contribute for their own country's economic development. So this is the very controversial issue, but I think the global community, all the non-government organizations, NGOs, and the civil society of the global context has to take this issue very seriously. They're giving the fund for them, grant for them. This is not actually, this is not the beneficiary for Bangladesh, and they are every day generating the newborn child, and which is cause that they are creating another Bangladesh. So it is a very big threat for us. Being a native I must have to raise this issue in anywhere else I get the chance. So anyway, actually, here some issues other than that.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you so much. We only have a few minutes, and I want to make sure that the three other panelists have a chance to say their final word. And so, Ambassador, over to you. Maybe one word, one sentence. What do we need to do better?
Thank you very much. And I'd like to borrow the remarks of Greta by saying that if you plan for women, you plan for the whole society. And to do that, we must pay attention to developing capacity, to ensuring that we have appropriate use of limited financial resources, and also coming back to the issue of disaggregated data. We need to pay attention to it to ensure that we have the right data to support the evidence that we require to take the appropriate decisions.
Yes, thank you. So we've heard about messaging, we've heard about data. Mr. Monroe?
Safeguards. Not everybody agrees with what we're talking about. So we need safeguards, safeguards, safeguards. And that, especially safeguards that take account for climate-induced trends in relation to infrastructure and protection of the vulnerable citizens, mostly those living in informal housing and mostly women. And we've done a lot of work, academic work on safeguards. And I'm pleased to say we are working now, planning with the government of Ghana to look at a 4-year program of how we actually take and practically implement safeguards and extend that in infrastructure projects in Ghana over the next few years.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright.
I'll just say that I think there were so many brilliant ideas today, but I think I would just say that infrastructure has a long lifespan and it has the potential to be part of the transformation we want to see, the inclusion, the leave no one behind transformation, and the climate resilient future that we want to see. So I just think we need to be designing for that transformation.
Thank you. Well, listen, we've come to the end of this conversation today. I would like to thank all of you, and I would also like to thank our audience for joining us today. We hope to continue this conversation with you in the future. I'm a mother of 2 young girls, and when I've listened to you, I feel inspired, and I feel like the future is brighter. And so thank you very much to everyone for joining us. We've now come to the end of this event on the margins of the 66th Commission on the Status of Women, and I wish all of you a really good day. Thank you again. Have a good day. Bye.